remains, and then inventory the remains to see what we have present and what's missing, examine any kind of defect or variation, and then make some estimations regarding age, ancestry, sex, stature, things like that.
Now, do you work for any particular agency?
I'm a consultant for 3 counties. I consult for San Bernardino County Coroner, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department Coroner Division, Kern County Sheriff's Department Coroner Division, and occasionally for Riverside County Sheriff's Department Coroner Division.
Let's talk a little bit about your educational background. What do you have to do to be a forensic anthropologist?
It's a lot. You need to have a bachelor's in anthropology, generally a master's in anthropology, and a PhD. In addition, you usually form some sort of internship relationship with someone else. So for myself, it was a 17-year long educational process. Yeah, it was a long time.
Okay. And so you got your bachelor's, your master's,
and then, and because I did my PhD at UCR, I had to redo my master's. They make you do all of the requirements. They don't assign you a second one. So technically, I've done it twice.
Okay. And you mentioned that you also did an internship.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So while I was doing my master's work at Cal State Fullerton, I was working under Dr. Judy Suchi. She was the forensic anthropologist for the 5 local counties, and she also pioneered the new pubic symphysis age phase determination. She was the first one who thought, hey, let's include girls. So I was really lucky about that.
And how long did you do that particular internship for?
We started working together in 1995. We stopped working together somewhere around 2001.
Did you do any other internships or anything like that related to forensic anthropology?
Well, not exactly an internship. One of the requirements that in the United States, in Europe it's different, but in the United States, most forensic anthropologists also function as forensic archaeologists. So we require there's no requirement that most of us do this. I went to field school to learn how to be an archaeologist in Cancun, which was lovely, and then I came back, and most of the master's work that I did for the second non-granted master's was for archaeology.
And how long did that last?
2 years. Well, the field school was only six weeks, but
okay.
2 years of study.
Now, after you become a forensic anthropologist, do you do any continuing education?
We do. It's not required, but we all attend the American Academy of Forensic Sciences conference, which is annual. And before the papers are given, we have workshops and things that we do ahead of time. If you require continuing education credit, like if you're an attorney, you can get it. If you don't require it, you just do it.
So different states have different requirements?
So yeah, different states have very different requirements.
Okay. Now, do you have any license requirements in the state of California?
We do not.
Do you provide any training?
Yes.
Who do you provide training to?
It depends on who asks, but I have trained forensic archaeology students for UCLA. I also train within the various sheriff's departments doing on-site training for everything from bone identification to excavation training, also for search and rescue, and for UCR's crime scene investigation certification program. I've provided training for that as well.
How long have you been doing that type of training?
I couldn't begin to tell you.
Long time?
18 years, 20 years, something like that.
I'm sorry to have to age you.
Yeah, sorry.
So approximately how many times have you examined skeletal remains?
A lot.
Can you give us over 500?
Yeah, over sure. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry.
Now, have you previously examined skeletal remains that have blunt force trauma?
Yes.
And again, I know you can't tell us an exact number, but can you tell us approximately? Would that also be over 500?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay.
Probably closer to 200. Not all of them were necessarily forensic. Sometimes they were blunt force trauma as a result of misadventure. But yeah.
Okay. Now, as a forensic anthropologist, in what ways do you assist in terms of crime scenes?
My job at a crime scene is to retain a context for evidence. So that may mean using archaeological techniques to retain things like shovel marks or things that you might find around a grave. Also to recover the evidence in I wouldn't say a more meticulous manner, but in a particularly prescribed meticulous manner.
You used a term, archaeological method?
Yes.
What is that?
So archaeological methods is based on of course, the principles of archaeology, where our primary goal is to preserve and maintain context so that we can relate maybe one object to another or something like that. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Thanks. Sorry, I wasn't sure.
That's okay. Now, do you also respond out to various different crime scenes?
Yes, for various reasons.
What dictates whether or not you respond?
Invitation.
Okay. Are there times where you're invited to a crime scene where you can't go?
Yes.
Okay. Are you still able to participate in a case if you can't go out to the crime scene?
Yeah, I'm usually involved in the autopsy whether or not I was present at the crime scene.
So it would be preferable if you can go to the crime scene, but that doesn't always happen?
Far preferable, yes.
Okay. Now, when you go out to a crime scene, is one of your roles to assist in the recovery of the remains?
Yes.
And how do you do that?
Again, it depends on the way the case is presented, but typically if there's, let's say we're talking about clandestine burial in this case or in another case.
I'm going to stop you for just a second.
Yeah.
What's a clandestine burial?
Clandestine burial is when an individual has been buried to be hidden.
Okay.
It's different than a cemetery burial,
Okay.
where everybody knows that's what you did there.
And so this type of a case, you would categorize it as a clandestine burial?
Yes.
What about this case would make you categorize it that way?
The lack of a cemetery or a marker or any of the typical burial practices that we do. Do you want me to continue?
I do, thank you.
All right, so we generally clear off whatever is on top of the surface, and then we start digging using fine tools like little rosewood picks or trowels or my personal favorite, my paintbrush, and then we go down in 10-centimeter intervals and document what we see each time as we go down until we get underneath the remains or hit sterile soil.
So when you're doing something like this that you call a clandestine burial and you start digging into the ground, for lack of a better word, how do you, when you come across something in the dirt, you indicated to go down by 10 centimeters at a time, you come across something, what do you do?
We stop and we document.
Okay, do you remove that item eventually?
Typically, once it's safe to remove, once we can see all of the edges of it, then we remove it.
Now, you indicated that you also, that one of the agencies you worked with was the San Bernardino County Coroner's Division, is that correct?
Correct.
And have you worked with various individuals there that also are familiar with the practice of recovering clandestine graves?
Yes.
Now, on November 11th of 2013, were you contacted by the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department regarding some remains that were recovered?
Yes, I was.
Can I get the overhead, please, Jackson? And I'm assuming you weren't out of that location at that time? You had to travel there?
It was my wedding anniversary.
Okay.
I was home.
Okay. So you actually, who first contacted you?
Deputy Andy Avery.
And when he contacted you, what happened?
Well, the first question was this human or non-human? I get sent a photograph typically to my cell phone or to my email, and we determine whether or not it's necessary to secure the scene. In this case, I determined that it was the remains were human. I did have some concern because
I'm going to stop you for just 1 second. So we're looking at what's been marked as People's Exhibit 751, and that's what's on the screen in front of you.
Yes.
You indicated that Deputy Avery contacted you And he sent you a picture, is that right?
He sent me two, yes.
He sent you two, okay. Is this a copy of one of the pictures that he sent you?
It looks like it.
Okay. Did you provide me with a picture this morning?
I did. If this is the picture I provided you with, then this is, yes, the
Okay.
picture I got.
So this is a picture that he sent you, and then you observed this picture, and did you have an opinion after you looked at this picture?
I did. I had an opinion that it was a human subadult, which is the term we use for before puberty.
So child?
Child.
Okay. So you take a look at this photograph, and then what do you do?
That's the part that I'm not. It was a while ago, but what I think I did was I told Deputy Avery that I was on my way. It was still in situ, and which means it was still near or around where where it had been located. And I wasn't very far away, so I responded to the scene. This is not uncommon. Particularly the older deputies, that was how we always responded before. And so I showed up because I was close.
Had you worked with this particular deputy before?
For over a decade at that point.
Okay. A little bit unusual, though, because you said it was your wedding anniversary, right?
Right. It turned out my husband wasn't going to be mad.
Okay, so you respond to the scene. And do you know or do you recall if you brought anything with you that day?
Other than my phone, I don't think so.
Okay. Did you take some pictures that day?
I did.
So I'm going to go through a series of pictures with you. Well, before I get to there, you indicated that you responded to the scene. Do you remember exactly where that was?
No, I remember up over the 15 and sort of to the left.
Okay, you got off you drove up there on the freeway?
Yeah.
And he gave you some directions about where to go?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall it being off of Stoddard Wells Road?
There has been more than one off of Stoddard Wells,
Okay.
so I don't know.
Okay. So moving on to what's been marked as Exhibit 750, do you recognize this?
Yes.
And what is this?
This is the scene as I step out of the car.
Okay. And you indicated that you believe that you took these pictures potentially with your phone?
Oh, no, actually, I took these pictures with my Canon.
Okay, so you brought a camera with you then?
I did. I have one in my trunk all the time. I'm sorry. I didn't understand exactly what you were asking me. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's my fault. So you go to the scene and you bring a camera with you. You have it in your trunk.
Yes.
And did you make contact there with Deputy Avery?
I did.
Okay, so you take some pictures and you indicated that this is a picture of the scene as it looked that day?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what did you...
This is a picture as I'm getting out of the car. The scene is some distance in. That flagging right there indicates that that's about where the initial remains were found.
Do you have a little laser pointer up there?
I do not.
You don't?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
I have a pen that just happens to be later.
Okay, so if you can show us the flagging.
There you go, right there. That flagging?
Okay, so there's like a little yellow piece of, I guess, sheriff's tape or something there.
And that's the sort of typical marking for it.
Now, was that where the actual location of the portion of the skull that you observed?
I wasn't present when it was removed, so I can't tell you for sure that's where it was. That is where Deputy Avery indicated to me it was located.
Okay. So after you, this is mountains behind you, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so you arrive at the scene, and you take this photograph as you're getting out, and then I assume you meet with Deputy Avery?
I did.
And what did you do next?
He had that's a frontal bone. He had the frontal bone in a Ziploc, an evidence Ziploc bag.
Okay.
So I took it, examined it, made a brief age window for the individual that we were looking for, and asked if we could then do a quick canvas, because children's remains in particular get carried off quite easily by animals. So if we could preserve anything, now is the time.
When you say that children's remains tend to get carried off by animals quite easily, why is that?
Because they're much smaller, and they're also statistically tastier, I guess. They are softer, so the animals have an easier time reaching the marrow.
So you want to do a quick canvas. What is it that you do next then?
So Deputy Avery and I do what we jokingly call the anthropological walkabout. It's not a grid. We walk in animal tracks or in riverbeds, places where likely places where animals will carry remains to feed. And we spread out some distance, and then we came across, first I came across a femur of an adult, and then close to that, the grave sites.
So I'm going to show you what's marked as Exhibit 535. You indicated that you observed the femur of an adult. So
That's
do you see
actually
that?
the tibia.
Oh, the
of an
tibia.
adult.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Sorry. Let me go through some of the photos. Here. These are all photos that you provided. So if you can identify what it is we're seeing in this photo. I sure wish I could.
What exhibit number is
Oh, I'm
that?
sorry, Your Honor. This would be Exhibit 533.
Those are actually non-human remains.
Those are non-human remains.
Yeah,
Okay, but you photographed those?
I did because they were co-located to the other remains.
How do you determine if something is human or non-human?
I have a background in addition to anthropology. I have a background in marine biology and zoology. That's part of the reason education takes so long. You need to learn a lot of different things in order to do the job. And functional morphology is something that most forensic anthropologists at some point we process and usually store animal remains either in our laboratories or at our home, and we practice.
So I don't think I used all of the photos that you provided, but I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 534. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And can you tell us what's depicted in that photo?
Those are two human ribs and a coprolate, which is a poop.
A what?
It's poop.
Oh, okay. Are these, you indicated two human remains, are you able to tell anything about whether or not this is a child or adult or anything with respect to these remains?
Not from this distance with these pictures. There is some difference between adult and human ribs, but that's an in your hand kind of thing.
Okay. And then showing you what we had talked about previously, this would be Exhibit 535. Was this also something you observed that day?
That is.
And what can you tell us about this?
That is a adult tibia. I can't right now, I'm sorry to tell you whether it's left or right, but it looks to me like it's a left, and it is not entirely intact.
Okay. I'm going to go back up to Exhibit 749. Right here. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
And can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
I'm going to use the pointer if you don't mind.
Please do.
What we're looking at here is a grave depression right there, and I also took it because of the tire tracks that were leading away from it before anybody else, any other agency were to show up in case they disappeared. So there is another grave that is, well, it's not in this picture, but it would be about there.
Do you recall what the distance was between the two graves?
Not directly, they're about 20 feet maybe at most.
So you're doing this quick canvas, and it's you and Deputy Avery. How do you decide what parameters you're going to use when you do this canvas?
We go until we say stop.
Okay. Are you two always within shouting distance or talking distance of each other?
Yeah, typically it's not just an issue of preserving chain of evidence, it's also an issue of safety.
And so in this particular case, do you recall about how many bones that you observed that day that were human remains?
I do not, I'm sorry.
Did you make any assessment at this point as to how many potential sets of remains you were dealing with?
Yes.
What was that assessment?
I was looking at 3 to 4 individuals, but at the time I knew at least 2. But so the way you determine how many individuals is there is things like nobody gets 3 left legs. So I had seen already that I had copies of the same side, so I had matching bones, if you will, that didn't, so they couldn't go to the same person. And so there were 2 adults, and then I had the children's remains, or the child's remains, which meant a third. And then I had seen some remains sticking out that I thought probably indicated a 4th.
Okay. You indicated that you saw some remains sticking out. Do you recall whether they were sticking out at grave A or grave B?
Well, you would have to tell me which one we designated as grade A or grade B. I don't remember.
So if the one in front of you, if we looked at that and said that's grave B.
Okay, grade B. Then it would be grade A.
Now, when you do this quick canvas, how worried are you about contaminating anything around you in terms of potential evidence?
Moderately. I mean, you have to weigh our need to get over a large distance versus preserving absolutely everything. In the desert, that's not possible anymore. So many factors have come in, from animals to weather to other people, coming through and all of that. The idea that you would have a pristine scene is something that you have to discard very early on.
Well, as you're walking around that day, can you tell us, you indicated that you saw tire tracks leading up to this particular grave that we see in the picture. Did you see other things indicative of animal activity?
Yes.
Did you see other tracks or things of indicative of maybe people riding dirt bikes or driving through there?
Yes.
Did you see other things indicative of footprints or anything like that?
I don't think I saw anything in terms of footprints. There was general cultural debris. Anytime you're out in the desert, there are cans and shotgun shells and all of this unrelated material that you kind of keep an eye on in case it turns out to be related, but most of the time you kind of walk past it, skirt it.
So as you go to this scene and you ultimately do this quick canvas, you indicated you are not dealing with a pristine crime scene at this point.
That is correct.
So if this is not a pristine crime scene, when you're walking around observing this, are you picking up items?
No, occasionally I'll pick up animal remains because I want to get them out of the field of play, if you will. Okay. And every once in a while you flip it over and make sure that you absolutely have an animal as opposed to some very unusual human.
Okay. I'm sure you've seen some unusual things.
I have.
Okay. So you determined that you're dealing with at least 2 adults and a child, and potentially another victim because you see something sticking out of the other grave, which we'll for now call grave A. What do you and Deputy Avery decide to do?
I asked him to call it in, and we asked for a deputy who can stand watch over the area until a recovery can be mounted the next day, because it was winter, and I think by the time we found the second grave, it was later. It was past 1, past 2, and we certainly couldn't mount something that large before it got dark.
That's my fault. I didn't ask you that question. Do you know approximately what time it was that you responded to the scene that day?
No.
Okay.
I want to say 11. It could have been 1. It was around lunchtime.
Okay. So and then you had to drive there?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know approximately how long that took you?
I wasn't very far away, okay. So probably, 20, 25 minutes.
How long do you think you spent out there that day?
2 hours.
Okay. Did you wait for the actual deputy to arrive
No, he was there when I got there.
No, I'm sorry, that's a very
Yeah,
bad question.
okay,
You
so
you
my
indicated
deputy.
you called it in, and we're going to have somebody watch over the area.
I stood over and watched until the deputy arrived.
Anything else that you did with respect to this case on November 11th?
Not that I recall.
Now, you come back on November 12th,
Yes.
and do you remember approximately what time you came back?
It was near dawn.
So very early in the morning?
Yes.
What do you do when you arrive?
The very first thing we do is we wait for the other responding personnel, so the individuals who do the crime scene photography and evidence processing, the homicide detectives, search and rescue, basically the whole crew comes, and then we have a briefing.
So whole crew, how many people are we talking about approximately?
On that first day, there were quite a few. I would say somewhere between 20 and 30.
So you do the briefing, and then what?
Then we proceed into the area with the graves, walking in a single file line.
Is it all of you going in one line together?
That was as I recall it. I mean, mostly like that.
Okay. At some point, do you break up into separate teams?
Almost immediately.
And how do you determine, or who determines, who goes into what team?
In this case, that was determined between the homicide detective and Deputy Robert Hunter.
Okay. Who was the homicide detective, if you recall?
I do not.
Now, you have indicated before that you're not dealing with a pristine crime scene,
Correct.
but we have 20 to 30 people out here now.
Yes.
And how do you and this team ensure that you're not going to contaminate anything with your own DNA?
Well, in short, we don't.
Why?
In a non-pristine crime environment, it's impractical. It's impractical to imagine we're going to blend the suit up to get into a hole. Now, in Europe, they do it that way, but here we have never done it that way. You know, because I'm the, I would say, primary investigator of these kinds of cases, my DNA has already been submitted to the DOJ. They have mine and have had since the early 2000s, so that in case there's any kind of contamination, they can separate mine out from a victim or a suspect.
Have you ever done any studies with respect to DNA?
No, but I mean, when you say do studies, I hear do research.
Okay.
Have I done research in regards to DNA? No. Have I collected a great deal of DNA? Yes.
Okay.
Did I attend classes that were about DNA during my graduate career? Yes.
Is it practical to try to recover DNA from a crime scene like this?
Objection, foundation.
Overruled.
No.
Your Honor, I haven't heard. Can we be heard?
No. The objection's overruled.
It isn't practical because the possibility for contamination just from the local environment is too high.
When you
Objection is foundation.
Overruled.
When you say the local environment, what is it that you're referring to?
I'm talking about that desert with, you know, the plants and the decomposing organisms and all of those things. DNA can be recovered in a lab from the remains or from anything if it's intact, but it's not something that we would be trying to necessarily recover at that location.
And objection is foundation is speculative.
Overruled.
So you indicated that you're going in a line and that you, at some point shortly thereafter or very close in time, you break into groups. Is that right?
Correct.
So, moving on to what's been marked as Exhibit 536. Do you recognize this?
Yes, I do.
And can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
This would be one of the partially uncovered graves. To the right, that's my dig bag. and my work bag. And this is a portable grid to help with context.
Now, in one of the previous pictures, we had talked about that grave and labeled it as potentially grave B. Is this a photograph of that same grave?
Yes.
Okay. And is this the grave that you worked on?
Yes.
So when you actually go up to the grave, what is it that you first do?
So the first thing that I did is figure out what's the extent of it so that I'm not accidentally sitting on it, which that's embarrassing.
Does that mean you measure it?
Not immediately. First,
Okay.
you walk it and you look for, you see the little pin flags here, you look for anything that might have been strewn out of it, and then you measure what you think is the extent of it. You may have to revise that measurement once you actually start doing excavations and see where the real grave walls lie.
Are there markers or something that we can see in this photo that you use to determine what the extent of the grave is?
No, I don't believe there is.
Okay, so you just place markers, those red markers. How do you determine where to place those?
Those red markers are not about the extent of the grave. What's on those red markers is there are little bits of bone there.
Okay.
And I'm just making sure that we don't sit on them or step on them.
Okay, so that is not the actual dimension of the grave
That
then?
is not.
Okay, so we have these red markers there that you looked at and you made a determination there were some pieces of bone there, is that right?
Correct.
And do you know at this point yet whether or not those pieces of bone are human or animal?
I'm sure I knew at the time, but I don't really know.
Okay, would that be something that you put in your report?
No, that would be something that Bob would have put in, I'm sorry, Deputy Hunter would have put in his report.
Who was working grave B with you?
Deputy Hunter,
Was there anybody else that was assisting?
not that I recall.
And other individuals were working grave A, is that right?
That is correct. With Deputy Hunter going between grave A and grave B.
Okay. And then moving on to what's been marked as People's Exhibit 538 for identification. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
And can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
So in this case, we're looking at grave B, and we're looking at the, basically the outside estimation of how long it would be.
And what do you use to determine that?
I was looking at changes in soil color and in density. When you dig a hole, you can never put the dirt back the way you got it out. The layers that were there before get tumbled. So I'm looking at basically the tumbling.
Okay. And so we see some additional off to the right side of the photograph. We see some additional red markers that you had indicated before. Are those also where you identify potentially pieces of bone?
Yes. And those look like they're human bones.
Okay. And did you record the actual dimensions for this grave?
Bob did.
Okay. Can you tell us exactly, does this picture show where you would have started in the grave?
It shows the outside edges of where we would start. Typically, I would start closer to an edge here, but instead it was decided to start center, which is your other choice.
And who made that determination?
Oh,
So what happens when you start to do the grave dig? Tell us what you do.
so in an ideal situation, we would sweep away the overburden. In this case, we know where the remains are in the grave in terms of them being dead center. So I would, in an ideal situation, start from my outside move in. In this case, though, we were pressed at it 4 times, so we started from the inside to move out. So we would start sweeping away at the bones that you can see to try and determine their length, where they start to stop.
You indicated that you knew that items were dead center in this particular
Yes.
case. How did you know that?
You can see them.
Can you show us on this photograph in terms of when you say you can see them, what you're looking at?
So there's some fabric here, but directly below the fabric you can see bone sticking out of the grave.
Okay. And I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 539? Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And can you tell us what is depicted in this photo?
This is when I first hit bone.
And that would be,
I've moved the fabric back. I haven't removed it from the wall, but I moved the fabric back. And I started sweeping, and I've got the top of bone right there.
okay, so we can see in this particular photo, I don't want to call it a shovel because it's not. I'm sure you have a term for it.
It's called a trowel.
A trowel, okay, just the general term. Up above there appears to be some fabric. Do you see that?
That's correct, yes.
And you indicated that you moved that back.
Right.
Was that actually covering that piece of bone that you see in the center of that photograph?
Yes. And this is how we're determining where is center.
Do you recall what piece of bone this was that you had recovered?
No, and as I'm looking at it, I'm having some real trouble figuring out from the photograph exactly what I'm looking at. I would need to see more of it uncovered.
Are these photographs that you're taking as the excavation of the grave is going along?
Correct.
Now, over time, are there things about the environment that can affect where things were actually initially placed in the grave?
Oh, yeah. We saw in the previous photo, you can see that the grave's been dug out somewhat. And it was dug out by carnivores.
So let me go back. This photo you were referring to, which would be Exhibit 538.
Correct. So you can see if you look at the way that the grave has changed. I assume it was flat before, but that I don't know.
If you have your, oh, there's your light,
So
okay.
if you can see how this has become very linear, and that is some sort of canid carnivore, so coyote dog, something like that, has pulled at that grave and changed it fundamentally from what it was at the time of placement.
So if a carnivore has dug up some of this grave and pulled at it, how is it that it gets recovered with soil again?
No, it isn't. That's how we ended up with the remains that were on the surface, as they were dragged out by carnivores. Also, wind can move them a little bit, but that's mostly carnivore activity.
Does any weather or rain or heavy rains or anything like that affect
Sure.
what we see in terms of the grave being essentially like there's some portions that have dirt back over it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We have that area in general, all the way through Stoddard Wells, all the way through that. There's an off-road park there. One of the reasons it's the designated spot is because the area has regular flooding, and flooding sort of evens the ground out a little bit, and it makes it more ideal for off-roading.
Okay. Now, showing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 540, do you recognize this?
Yes.
And can you tell us what's depicted in that photo?
What we're looking at there is a rib from, looks like an adult, and some hair.
And would that be the first human remains that you actually removed from the grave?
Those are the first human remains that were removed from the grave.
Do you remember what depth those remains were located
I
at?
do not.
Would
They're
that-
relatively shallow, though.
Would that be reflected in your report?
I believe so.
Would it refresh your recollection to review that?
Yes, please.
Do you have a copy of your report?
I have an electronic copy. Is that all right if I open that, or would you prefer I use paper?
You can use either one, whichever is easiest for you.
Just let us know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay.
So I first made contact with human remains at about a foot down, but that isn't where those came from. What I'm finding at, yeah, actually I take that back. This is, those remains were found at approximately 12 inches of depth.
Okay. Did you make any record of how deep this actual grave went?
I was not present when it was complete, so I didn't make a record of its actual total depth. although I believe I discuss it in my report that it's as it's related to what Deputy Hunter said.
It's primary, happens to all of us.
Okay, so you indicated that in this particular photo, there's a portion of a rib, and then you indicated there's something about hair. Is there something else attached to the hair?
There's a little bit of cranial fragment attached to the hair.
Now, you take these, from what I understand from the photograph and what you had testified to, you're working through the grave, and can you explain to us when you uncover something that you believe to be remains or bones, tell us what you're doing in this picture.
I'm documenting what has come out of the grave because I'm going to continue excavating, and I don't want to, this was loose, so if we had continued to brush, it would just be gone, so we're taking it out and putting it aside.
When you put it aside, where are you putting it?
In an evidence bag. I think it's actually laying on the evidence paper right there.
Okay. Do you wrap the pieces individually?
Individually, like, is the rib separated from the hair? No, the pieces came out together, they'll get wrapped together.
Okay. So after you recovered this portion, what did you do next?
I continued excavating for, I don't know how long, but for some time. And then I turned the grave over to Deputy Hunter.
Did you find anything else during the time frame that you continued excavating?
Yes.
And if you refer to your report, you just need to let us know so we can put it on the record.
I am referring down to my report because I couldn't remember if it was 1 or 2 cervical vertebrae, but it's 2.
Okay. What else did you locate as you continued going through the grave?
I think there was some fabric, and beyond that, I'd have to look. I have compartmentalized this case so well,
Okay.
I don't remember a thing. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Would it refresh your recollection to review that portion of your report?
It would.
Okay.
That looks like that's all I found. It looks like I found cranial fragments, cervical fragments, and hair.
Okay. Do you recall finding additional cranial fragments?
Not in, there were some additional cranial fragments, but I understand more of them were recovered after I left.
Okay. Do the remains that you recovered consist of the area primarily towards the center of the grave where you were working?
The additional remains of after we find the hair and the rib, those are more north in the grave,
Okay.
and they're also more shallow. So I started moving up. I was trying to figure out where the edge of the grave was, and so I was kind of taking the center and kind of marching my way towards the edge.
And you indicated that the additional remains you found were at a different shallow level?
At a different depth.
What depth were those at?
About 7 inches.
Now, you indicated that at some point you turned the scene over to Deputy Hunter. Do you recall about what time that was?
About 10 o'clock.
And why was that?
I had a class at 2.
Now, you indicated also that you worked with the Sheriff's Department in excavations and things like that on prior cases. Is that right?
Yes,
Are there more than one way to do an excavation?
absolutely.
And is there anything in terms of a preferred method of excavation, or
As long as you have your ultimate goal in mind, which is to preserve context, you'll find many different ways of doing it. My archaeological colleagues may attack it differently than I might attack it, and I might attack it differently than someone else might.
did you do anything else prior to leaving the scene that day after you stopped working on grave B?
Yeah, I actually did another quick canvas. Because the search and rescue and the other folks who were out there, they were pin flagging those little red flags, bones as they found them. So I was going out to those bones to make sure they were non-human so that we didn't suddenly have a scene that was 3 miles wide.
Okay. Did you return to the scene on November 13th?
I did.
Do you recall approximately what time that was?
I do not, may I refer?
If it would refresh your recollection.
Oh, I did not write it down. That would come in the morning.
So when you go back to the scene on November 13th, is it still all set up in terms of deputies are out there working and things like that?
Yeah, we have coroners, personnel, and deputies. Everyone is present, and the work proceeded in my absence.
Were you informed of any additional developments in terms of what had been located?
I had been told that in the grave I was working on that more cranial fragments had come out of the grave, and sort of generalized reports from different personnel while they were there.
When you returned on November 13th, had they finished the excavation on grave B?
It was not yet done.
Did you assist in any manner in terms of the completion of the excavation of grave B?
I did not. I continued clearing bones.
Is there any particular reason that you didn't assist in the excavation when you returned on November 13th?
You can put only so many people in a hole.
Okay.
And at that point, I wasn't going to disturb what Bob had already pretty much done mostly. And I was more needed in the other parts of the scene.
You continued then assisting with the determination of whether the remains were human or animal, is that right?
That's correct.
So the red flags that you showed us before, was it your job to then at that point go around to each of those red flags and determine?
Yes.
Okay. Did you take any additional photographs on November 13th when you were going around to those different red flags and determining whether the remains were human or animal?
I don't think so.
So if I were to show you a series of photos right now, would it be
I'd
difficult?
have to say, well, I was wrong.
Okay. No, not photos you took, but if I pulled out a series of photos and you looked at them right now, would you be able to determine what bone was found at what flag?
It depends. Oh, what flag? No. I would not be able to do that.
Okay. Did you find additional material on the surface that was pertinent to the investigation?
I did.
What did you do with those materials?
We would measure out to them. So where the graves are, we put what's called a datum, which is like a central measuring point, so that everything that is measured to is measured from that datum. And then we would measure out from that to the location so that we preserve as much context as we can preserve, and we're already in. So primary context is when you first put things down. And in this case, we were in secondary or already tertiary context, and we were doing our best to not make it quaternary or etc. So in other words, mark where it is right now before it gets moved here.
Okay. How do you determine, so you're going around and you're determining these remains, whether they're animal or human, then how do you determine which remains go with which individual? You indicated that there were about 2 adults, and at this point had you learned that there were 2 children?
Yes.
How do you determine as you're walking around and looking at various remains who they belong to?
So there are differences between male and female remains, and differences in this particular case between the ages of the children, so there's differences in sizes. But in general, if they are together, we're going to keep them together until we get to the lab, and then we'll start spreading them out. The things that are obvious, where you obviously know this goes to this individual or this goes to this individual, we'll keep those separate. But then we'll do most of the association back at the morgue.
Now, as you gathered these different remains, were there pieces of bone that you were not able to attribute to a particular individual?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about that?
There are some portions of humans where we are pretty much the exact same as every other mammal, and there are lots of dead mammals in the desert. So I brought everything back and determined what I could determine in some little fragments of things that I wouldn't be able to tell you if it was human or animal without doing a DNA test, and we aren't going to do that.
Okay. So did you do anything else then on November 13th when you returned to the scene?
Not to my recollection, other than I did walk over to grave A and poke my head over and see what they were doing in grave A.
Is there anything about that that you consider to be unusual or that factored into your opinion on this case?
They were pedestaling the way I'm the way I would hope they would do.
Okay. Did you attend the autopsies?
I did.
Now, is it important for you as a forensic archaeologist to attend the autopsies?
As a forensic anthropologist,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
I
it's
said
important for me to attend the autopsies, again, provided I'm invited.
Were you invited in this case?
I was.
And when you attend an autopsy, whose responsibility is it to determine the cause of death?
Cause and manner of death both are done by the pathologist,
What
the
is your
medical examiner.
Okay. What is your role when you attend the autopsy?
I perform in more of an assisted capacity, so because I study bones and I understand their variation, I help in things like, is that something that is pathological, the course of disease, or is that something that is just a normal human variation, or is that something as a result of an outside force?
So, do you recall when the autopsies were actually conducted?
It was a few days later.
And is it Dr. Shanksy that did the actual autopsies?
Yeah, Dr. Changshri did the autopsies.
So explain to us, when you go into the autopsy room to conduct the autopsies, how does it work?
So in this case, we took a secondary autopsy room, so it's its own closed room, so it's not, we have a larger autopsy suite where we can do 6 or 8 bodies at a time. In this case, we were in a smaller room. The remains came in the boxes that we had put them in the field. And then we lay out 4 tables because we assume now we have 4 individuals. And then we start unpacking the boxes. This is mostly me rather than Dr. Changshri. It's my job then to assemble them in order to the best of our ability with the way they are now without changing them in any way. So this is like we wouldn't undress them at this point or anything like that. And then lay them out in order and then start the inventory process. What have I got and what am I missing? And in one of the individuals, there was still a great deal of encrusted dirt and other material around, so that inventory gets delayed until we can actually make sure what we can see.
So essentially, when you assist in this, you're almost putting together a puzzle when
Yes.
you're putting together the skeleton. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, different than when you're working out in the field, is this in a more controlled environment?
This is a very controlled environment.
Explain that to us.
So the room that we used is the same room that we use for harvesting bone marrow or bones. It's called the sterile room. It's not really sterile, but it's the sterile room.
Are you fully covered from head to toe when you work in this capacity?
Almost head to toe. So I have a face mask on. I have a little plastic shield that goes over my face. My hair is covered. I'm in scrubs. I'm wearing gloves. I have a coat on or a paper gown. I have to switch back and forth. But I think you can see my neck and stuff.
Okay. So part of your role, also in assisting in an autopsy, is to help determine age, sex, ancestry, and things of that nature, right?
That's correct.
And in this case, we have a stipulation to the identity of the victim, so we're not going to go into the specifics of that. Now, you indicated that when you first went out to the scene, and I think this is reflected somewhat when you assisted in the autopsy, that several parts of the remains had been exposed to the elements.
That's correct.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 350. Do you recognize this?
I do.
And can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
We're looking at the frontal bone of a subadult, several bone fragments that are possible cranial bone fragments, and then the remainder are ribs.
Now, in looking at this, we clearly see a differentiation in colors between some of the bones that we're viewing. Can you explain that?
So the bones that were still protected by dirt, they're going to be more moist and they're going to be darker in color. And then you have a set of remains that are on the surface, bony remains without tissue on them. All bone has a little, almost like a little skin on the outside. It's called the periosteum. And once that's gone, the bone starts drying out really rapidly. So what you're seeing here is flaking. It turns white, it bleaches, and it flakes, which is why it looks like it's got those little cracks in it, because the protective skin isn't on it anymore.
Okay, so when you talk about that, that's not actually trauma to the bone, it's just the
That's
flaking?
weathering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you determine from these remains that are weathered approximately how long they've been exposed?
I can give you big generalities. So in order to be more specific, what we would need to have is essentially scientific repeatability. We'd have to have something like a body farm here. We don't have that. They have them in other states, but they have a different climate than we have. We have had some controlled studies that were done in Arizona by Dr. Allison Galloway and Dr. Walt Berkeley. And from their study, if we were to apply that to our environment, we're pretty close in terms of humidity and animal availability, so it's mostly applicable. We would have to say months to years at the outside.
Do you have a minimum number of months?
At least 2 in terms of it's being exposed. That doesn't mean that the individual's been gone for 2 months. It means that's about how long it's probably been on the surface. Although, you see that little patch in the center?
Can you show us
See
here?
that little patch there in the center?
Yes.
That's still pretty moist. So that indicates that it probably was flipped upside down, and that was the resting point against the soil. And it's not in terrible shape. So if it was longer than a couple months, I would be super surprised.
Would that be your opinion, and would that be consistent with the other remains that you observed that were located out of the graves?
Some of the other remains showed a little more weathering, like that tibia that we saw before. It was completely white, and it was white on all sides, which meant that it had moved along at some point along that desert floor because it got turned.
Okay.
Is that really the answer to?
Yeah, we can talk about
my question. Yeah.
Yeah, we can go back to the tibia shortly, but now we have a bone there that's darker in color. And can you give us an idea in terms of how long that bone had been inside of a grave?
Months to years. So when you bury an individual or anything, it slows the process down quite a bit as opposed to if you left it on the surface.
I'm going to stop you for just a second.
Yeah.
What process are you referring to?
The decompositional process, the process from looking like a person to looking like a skeleton.
So if something is buried, it takes longer for that to occur?
It does. One of the things that I looked for when I was at the scene was the composition of the soil. Was it more acidic or was it more basic? If it's closer to a neutral pH, it'll take a really long time to decompose. But if it's on either side, if it's either too acid or too base, the process becomes more rapid depending on the amount of acid versus neutrality that you have there. And in this case, the soil itself was actually pretty acidic. So at minimum, it was going to be 2 years, but it was probably somewhere between 2 and 5.
That's the best estimate that you can
That is the
provide?
very best I can do,
Okay.
short of having been there.
Now, after you review remains and you set them, you only do one at a time, is that right?
That's correct.
And do you determine whether or not there's been any trauma to the remains?
Yes.
How do you do that?
So we examine the remains for any kind of defect, anything where it's different than we would expect it to look like. So is the is the bone broken? Is it healed too? That's other things that may help us in identification. So like if you break an elbow, let's say, after it's been repaired, we might be able to narrow it down to you based on that. So we look for all of those kinds of characteristics.
In all of these autopsies, was there anything in terms of prior injuries that was used to identify them?
Not that I recall.
Okay. In this particular set of remains, did you observe anything that was unusual to you in terms of trauma?
Oh, yeah.
What did you observe?
I observed significant trauma to, okay, significant is before we even get picked at it on that one. I observed a lot of trauma to the, mostly to the head, but also to the legs of an adult.
So looking at just these particular remains in front of you, was there anything about these remains that you considered as potential trauma?
Yeah, well, I think with this one I couldn't determine the source of it, but right there.
Can you describe what you're pointing out?
Okay, so this right here is a fracture through the bone. This side should look like this side. You see how this has no fracture, and this
Yes.
has this big fracture through it. Now, this all across here, that's actually normal because the individual had not finished growing, so the pieces weren't fused together yet.
Can you attribute that fracture to trauma?
I don't believe that I can determine that at this point.
What is it about that that leads you to believe? Because you've indicated that that's not normal. How is that inconsistent, or could it be not trauma, if that makes sense?
So there's more than one way to break bone, and what I couldn't determine at the time was whether that was a perimortem fracture or a postmortem fracture.
So let me stop you there.
All right.
What's a perimortem fracture?
So perimortem means at or around the time of death. Post means after death. Ante would be before. So in this case, one of the things that I use to determine whether or not a fracture is a perimortem fracture or a postmortem fracture would be decompositional fluid in the fracture. So when you start decomposing, various organs in the blood and all of that, they start breaking down. And as they break down, if there is a crack or a hole in the bone, it'll seep in and then it'll stain that location. And decompositional fluid is like yellow, dark, or brown. And I didn't see any decompositional fluid in that fracture. So without that, I don't feel like I have sufficient evidence to talk about it because that bone remained flexible for some time after death, unlike an adult.
What do you mean when you say that bone remained flexible?
So that frontal bone, the one with the eyes there, when you encounter bone where the individual is living, bone is actually kind of amazing. It has this really amazing tensile strength that's really strong because it's a combination of inorganic and organic materials. So it's collagen and it's also calcium and phosphates. And this combination actually lets it kind of bend. You know, if you've ever had that accident where you were like, I should have died, and you're fine, you're balanced, thanks to that lovely bending that you can do in the bone. After you pass, that collagen isn't being fed anymore, and you start losing the ability to kind of bend with, so the bone loses its flexibility and just becomes more rigid as it mineralizes. So as we've lost the organic material and dominate the inorganic material, it becomes easier to break, and it breaks differently. Kids, before you're fully grown, you have a higher proportion of organic material to inorganic material, so more collagen. So there's a lot, that collagen lasts longer because there's more of it. So you're more flexible, you can break stuff, or you can bend stuff without breaking it.
Okay, so kids have more elasticity or more flexibility in their bones? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you indicated that you couldn't render an opinion about that because of that fluid that you spoke of. Would exposure to the elements have an effect on that fluid that you talked about?
It can.
Okay. But you can't say anything about that in this particular case?
I wouldn't feel comfortable stepping in there.
Okay. Moving on to what's been marked as Exhibit 542. Can you tell
Actually,
us?
before we get to that, why don't we go ahead and take our morning recess, it's 10, 15 minutes. keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case. We'll see everyone back in about 15 minutes.